The state of Virginia thought it was carrying out justice when it executed William Morva, but they had no idea what was really dying that night. Because behind that final moment was a story far more disturbing than a simple crime, a story buried under years of missed warnings, wrong assumptions, and a mind quietly collapsing in plain sight. 2 innocent men lost their lives, a community was shattered, and the system designed to stop tragedies exactly like this one never stepped in until it was far too late. But here's the part almost nobody wants to touch. These deaths didn't begin with violence. They began with symptoms everyone saw and ignored. A young man slipping away from reality while people around him kept hoping he'd grow out of it. A diagnosis that should have saved lives but instead pushed the story toward its darkest chapter. And a question that still haunts everyone who studies this case. Were these murders preventable years before they ever happened? That's the part of this story that makes it impossible to look away. Because once you understand how William Morva unraveled, and how every safety net meant to protect him failed one by one, you start to see this tragedy in a completely different light. William Morva didn't wake up one day disconnected from reality. His unraveling started quietly, almost invisibly, inside a home that looked ordinary from the outside. His father was strict, emotionally cold, the kind of parent who could turn every mistake into a reminder that William wasn't enough. That pressure didn't make him stronger, it hollowed him out. By the time he reached high school, people close to him sensed something deeper was slipping. His friends couldn't name it, but they knew the light in him was dimming. He wasn't rebellious or dramatic, he was drifting, slowly, steadily, from the world everyone else lived in. When he dropped out at 18, it didn't spark alarm. Plenty of kids quit school. But for William, it marked the moment the ground beneath him began to crack. The confusion he felt wasn't teenage angst. It was the early tremor of a brain that had started misfiring years before anyone realized. He felt out of place, disconnected, like the world wasn't built for him. And instead of help, he got silence. The worst part? People did notice something was wrong, but none of it looked dangerous. He wasn't violent. He wasn't threatening. He was just off. And in a system where you can't force treatment unless someone is in immediate danger, William slipped past every checkpoint. His family watched him change but had no power to intervene. The signs were there, glowing like warning lights on a dashboard, but no one had the authority, or the understanding, to act. He was already losing his grip on reality. No one knew they were watching the beginning of a tragedy. But the moment his father died, everything that was fragile inside him finally broke. Charles Morva's death in 2004 didn't just devastate William. It snapped the last thread holding him in place. Whatever stability he'd been clinging to vanished overnight. Grief didn't hit him normally, it detonated. And when the dust settled, the person he'd been before was gone. What came next looked bizarre from the outside, but inside William's mind, it all made perfect sense. He stopped wearing shoes entirely, no matter the weather. Snow, rain, blistering summer heat, he walked through it barefoot until the skin on his feet thickened like an animal's. Then came his new diet: raw meat, berries, pine cones. Not because he wanted attention or because he'd adopted some strange lifestyle. He believed the world was collapsing. He thought he needed to live like a survivalist to make it through an apocalypse only he could see coming. Eventually, the woods around Virginia Tech became his entire world. He built shelters, slept under trees, and drifted through campus like a ghost from another era. Students whispered about him, calling him the barefoot guy or the conspiracy dude. Professors saw him muttering about government plots and the end of civilization. People watched him emerge from the tree line, disheveled and wild-eyed, but almost everyone shrugged it off. Just another eccentric, just another oddball on campus. But what they were seeing wasn't eccentricity. It was untreated psychosis tightening its grip. His thoughts jumped without logic. He spoke in fragments. He stared through people like they weren't real. The boundary between reality and delusion was dissolving, and William had no idea it was happening. In his mind, he was the only person awake in a world full of blind fools. And still, nobody could force him into treatment. He wasn't violent. He wasn't making threats. He was simply disappearing into an alternate reality while the real one watched from a distance. Then one night, his delusions convinced him he needed to act, and that's when this quiet unraveling turned dangerous. By August 2005, William's mind had drifted so far from reality that even routine moments felt like threats. So when he showed up outside a Blacksburg deli after closing hours, masked and carrying a weapon, he wasn't trying to commit a normal robbery. In his fractured worldview, he was gathering supplies for a collapse he believed was only days away. To everyone else, it looked like a crime in progress. To William, it was survival. Police arrested him that night, and this should have been the turning point, the moment doctors finally saw the truth. A comprehensive evaluation could have revealed the delusions driving every decision he made. Antipsychotics could have slowed the chaos in his mind. Therapy could have pulled him back toward reality. This was the moment the system should have stepped in. Instead, he was given a quick, surface-level psychiatric assessment. Nothing deep, nothing detailed, just a basic check to decide if he was competent enough to face charges. The diagnosis? Schizotypal personality disorder, a condition marked by odd thoughts and unusual behavior, but not the break from reality William was clearly experiencing. It was the wrong diagnosis, and it changed everything. With that single mistake, he was pushed back into jail without medication, without treatment, without anyone realizing how severe his condition truly was. Locked in a cell, isolated and terrified, his paranoia exploded. What little clarity he had left evaporated. He became convinced the deputies were plotting to end him, that every noise outside his door was a sign the conspiracy was closing in. And the longer he sat untreated, the stronger those delusions grew, building pressure like a sealed chamber ready to burst. Soon, that pressure would erupt, and the consequences would be irreversible. After nearly a year behind bars with no treatment, William's mind was a maze of fear. Every day in that cell fed the delusion that deputies wanted him gone. Every footstep in the hallway felt like the start of an attack. By August 2006, he was living in a constant state of survival mode, convinced he was one wrong move away from being silenced forever. So when he complained of pain in his wrist and ankle, the transport to the hospital felt like a trap. To everyone else, it was routine. To William, it was the moment the conspiracy would finally strike. Inside the hospital bathroom, surrounded by white tile and fluorescent lights, his paranoia snapped into full-blown panic. He scanned the room the way someone scans a battlefield. His eyes locked onto a metal toilet paper dispenser, heavy enough to become a weapon in a mind fueled by terror. And in his delusional understanding of the world, this wasn't an attack, it was a last stand. Deputy Russell Quisenberry stepped close, expecting nothing more than a calm, uneventful escort. Instead, William swung. The metal slammed against the deputy, dropping him instantly. In William's distorted reality, he wasn't hurting a guard. He was escaping people he believed were about to off him. He took the deputy's weapon and stepped into the hallway, adrenaline drowning out logic. That's when Derek McFarland heard the commotion. A hospital security guard, a husband, a man who'd built a career on helping people in moments of crisis. He ran toward the noise because that's what good people do. They go toward trouble, not away from it. But William didn't see a helper. He didn't see a man trying to protect the hospital. He saw another threat closing in, another figure in the imagined plot against him. The shot he fired ended Derek's life within minutes. One moment of delusion, one misdiagnosis, one terrified mind acting on a world that didn't exist. William fled into the forest, the only place that had ever made sense to him, while alarms echoed behind him. But the tragedy wasn't over. The manhunt that followed would lead to another death, and another family shattered. The second William disappeared into the woods, the entire region snapped into crisis mode. Police from every nearby agency flooded the area, racing down back roads, spreading through the trees, sweeping the Virginia Tech campus with helicopters and K-9 units. Students locked themselves inside dorms. Faculty sheltered wherever they could. Nobody knew where William was hiding, only that he was armed, frightened, and lost inside a reality no one else could see. For officers on the ground, the search felt like navigating a maze built by someone who knew every twist and shadow. William had spent years living in those woods. The trails were his home. The trees were familiar. He could vanish in seconds, slip between branches, and move silently while hundreds of officers tried to guess his next step. The longer the manhunt dragged on, the more fear tightened around the community. Everyone sensed that another encounter was inevitable. And that encounter came the next morning. Corporal Eric Sutphin knew exactly what danger looked like. Years earlier, he'd survived a shooting that took the life of his partner, a trauma that drove him to leave law enforcement entirely. But after months away, the pull to serve his community pulled him back. He put the uniform on again, fully aware of the risks, and chose duty over safety. On August 21st, Eric was assigned to search the Huckleberry Trail, a quiet bike path cutting through dense brush. He walked it carefully, scanning every opening in the tree line, hoping to find William before anyone else got hurt. What Eric didn't know was that William was already watching him, hidden in the undergrowth, terrified and convinced that every officer hunting for him was part of the plot to end his life. In that fractured state, a man approaching on a trail didn't look like help. It looked like danger closing in. William fired. Eric fell almost instantly, a father to 9-year-old twins, a husband, a man who'd already survived one nightmare only to lose his life in another he never saw coming. The search ended hours later when officers found William curled inside a thicket of briars, shirtless, shoeless, bleeding from scratches, exhausted, and still locked inside the delusion that had been controlling him for years. He didn't fight. He didn't run. He simply surrendered, unaware that 2 families had been destroyed and that his own fate was now sealed. And yet, even with 2 lives lost and the community in shock, the system still didn't understand what had truly driven him. When William was taken into custody, the public saw a dangerous fugitive finally caught. Prosecutors saw an airtight case. But almost no one saw the truth, that William was still trapped inside the same hallucinated world that had driven every one of his actions. His trial moved quickly. The prosecution presented the facts with brutal clarity. The escape, the attacks, the 2 men who never made it home. Witnesses testified. Physical evidence was laid out in detail. To the jury, it looked simple. A man who made choices, pulled triggers, and caused irreversible devastation. The defense tried to show that something was wrong with William's mind, but the only diagnosis they had was the one from his rushed 2005 evaluation. Schizotypal personality disorder, a condition that sounds strange, but still implies someone who understands reality. Someone who knows right from wrong. Someone who can make choices. So while the jury heard about his odd behavior, the barefoot wandering, the raw meat diet, the years living in the woods, they didn't hear the one thing that mattered most, that William's brain was no longer tethered to reality. They didn't hear that he wasn't choosing threats, he was seeing them. They didn't hear that his entire perception of the world had been hijacked by a delusional disorder nobody had diagnosed yet. They were sentencing a version of William that never existed. The trial lasted just over a week. The verdict came back fast, guilty of capital murder. Then came the sentencing phase, the moment that would decide whether he lived or died. The prosecution pushed for execution. The defense argued for life. And the jury, operating under the belief that William understood his actions, chose death. One decision, one misdiagnosis, one life-ending sentence built on incomplete information. The judge set the execution date. The appeals began, and for a while, it looked like the system was moving exactly the way it always had. But everything was about to shift, because once experts finally dug into William's mind, they uncovered the truth the jury never heard. Once the appeals process began, William's new attorneys did what the original system never had: they looked deeper. They brought in specialists, reviewed his history, interviewed him at length, and sifted through every detail of his behavior from the years before the killings. And what they discovered stripped the entire case down to its core. The original diagnosis was wrong. Not just slightly off, completely inaccurate. Dr. Pablo Stewart, a psychiatrist with decades of experience, spent extensive time evaluating William. His conclusion was unmistakable. William didn't have a quirky personality disorder. He had delusional disorder, a condition that doesn't just distort thinking, it replaces reality. Where someone with a personality disorder might have odd beliefs, a person with delusional disorder lives in a world created by their own malfunctioning brain. That meant every fear William felt behind bars wasn't imagination. It was his reality. Every person he thought was hunting him wasn't a metaphor. It was a perceived threat. The officers, the hospital staff, the deputies, his brain presented all of them as predators closing in. And when a brain can't separate danger from hallucination, it reacts the only way it knows how: survival at any cost. The tragedy was that none of this information had been available during the trial. The jury had judged a man they believed understood what he was doing. They never learned he was navigating a nightmare his mind projected over the real world. They never heard how long he'd been unraveling or how obvious the signs were in hindsight. They never knew his untreated illness dictated the violence they were sentencing him for. Armed with the new diagnosis, William's attorneys argued that executing someone who couldn't grasp reality violated the basic principles of justice. They took the fight to the Virginia Supreme Court, then to federal courts, then all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Every appeal hit the same wall. Court after court acknowledged the new evidence, and still upheld the death sentence. Judges admitted the diagnosis might be more accurate, but ruled it didn't change the legal bottom line. In their eyes, William still knew killing was wrong, even if his brain was distorting everything around him. By 2017, nearly every legal avenue had been exhausted. The system had made up its mind. But outside the courtroom, something unexpected was happening. Advocacy groups began rallying. Mental health experts warned that executing a man with Williams' condition would set a dangerous precedent. International organizations took notice. Lawmakers started speaking out. Pressure was building in a way Virginia had rarely seen. And then the most surprising voice of all stepped forward, one that changed the entire conversation. It came from someone who had more reason than anyone else to want William dead, yet asked the state to spare him. As the execution date drew closer, the pressure on Virginia's governor kept building. Advocacy groups were sending letters. Mental health experts were warning about the consequences. International organizations were weighing in. Even lawmakers who normally supported capital punishment were urging caution. But none of it carried the emotional weight of what happened next. A statement appeared from someone whose voice nobody expected to hear: Rachel Sutphin, the daughter of Deputy Eric Sutphin, one of the two men William had killed. By every measure, she should have been the loudest supporter of the execution. Her father had been taken from her when she was just a child. She'd grown up with an empty seat at the table, a quiet house where a parent should have been, and memories that froze in time the moment he died. If anyone had a right to demand the harshest punishment, it was her. But Rachel did the opposite. She stepped forward and asked the state not to execute the man who had taken her father's life. She argued that William wasn't acting out of hatred or malice. He was acting under the control of an untreated, undiscovered illness that warped everything he saw. She said executing someone in that condition wouldn't heal her family or honor her father. It wouldn't bring closure. It wouldn't fix the failures that led to the tragedy. Her plea wasn't just surprising, it stunned people. Mercy coming from a victim's family is rare. Mercy coming from the daughter of a fallen deputy is almost unheard of. And yet Rachel believed compassion was the only path that made sense. She understood something the legal system had repeatedly overlooked. Her father died because William never got the help he needed. Her voice added a layer of humanity to a case already drowning in complexity. It wasn't activists arguing for clemency. It wasn't strangers sympathetic to mental health issues. It was the daughter of a man whose absence she'd felt every single day. But even with her plea, even with tens of thousands of signatures, even with international pressure and medical evidence, the final decision still rested with one person, and he was running out of time. What happened next brought the entire story to its final, irreversible turning point. When all the letters were read, all the signatures counted, and every expert weighed in, the decision landed on the desk of Governor Terry McAuliffe. He had the power to stop the execution with a single signature. And for a brief moment, it seemed possible. The pressure was enormous. Medical professionals, lawmakers, international leaders, and even the daughter of a murdered deputy were urging mercy. But when his statement finally came out, it was only a few paragraphs long, and the meaning was unmistakable. Clemency denied. He acknowledged William's mental illness. He acknowledged the misdiagnosis. But he pointed to the court rulings, the verdicts, the appeals, and said the execution would proceed. After years of fighting, the outcome was sealed. On July 6, 2017, William Charles Morva was strapped to the gurney inside Greensville Correctional Center. A prison official asked if he had any final words. William stared straight ahead and simply said, "No. No apology, no explanation, no final message, just one quiet syllable from a man who had spent years living inside a reality no one else could see." Minutes later, the chemicals entered his bloodstream. At 9:15 p.m., his heart stopped. He was 35 years old, and the last person the state of Virginia would ever execute. But the story didn't end on that gurney. In a twist nobody expected, William's death became a catalyst. Less than 4 years later, Virginia abolished the death penalty entirely, becoming the first Southern state in history to do so. Lawmakers pointed to cases like Williams as proof that the system couldn't reliably separate intentional violence from untreated illness. His execution became a symbol, a warning of what happens when the cracks in the mental health system are ignored until it's too late. The contrast became even sharper when his younger brother, Michael, was diagnosed with the same disorder years later. Same condition, same genetic thread, but Michael received medication, therapy, and support. His delusions were treated before they spiraled. He was eventually released from prison. He lived, he stabilized, he survived the illness that destroyed his brother's life. The only difference between them wasn't character or morality. It was timing, and the presence of a system that finally intervened. Two innocent men, Derek McFarland and Eric Sutphin, lost their lives because William never received that intervention. Two families were shattered because every warning sign was overlooked. And another death, William's, was added to the tragedy, even though it solved nothing. Rachel Sutphin understood that painful truth. She lost her father, yet still pleaded for mercy. She recognized that her father wasn't taken by a monster. He was taken by a man battling a mind that no longer functioned. Her compassion highlighted what the justice system failed to see. And it leaves us with the hardest question of all. How many tragedies could be prevented if the system treated mental illness before it turned deadly? William Morva's story isn't just about one man or one crime. It's about a system that watched a mind collapse in slow motion and never stepped in. A system that mistook psychosis for odd behavior. A system that punished the symptoms of an illness it failed to treat. And in the end, 3 families paid the price, 2 through unimaginable loss, and 1 through an execution that didn't solve anything. Virginia ended capital punishment 4 years after William died. But abolishing the death penalty didn't answer the question his case leaves hanging in the air. How many tragedies begin long before the violence ever happens? The truth is unsettling. When mental illness goes untreated, when warning signs are brushed aside, when diagnoses are rushed or wrong, the consequences don't just fall on the person who's suffering, they ripple outward into entire communities. William's brother showed what could have happened if the system acted sooner. With the right treatment, his delusions faded. He rebuilt his life. He survived the same disorder that destroyed William's. And that contrast, 2 brothers with the same illness, 2 completely different outcomes, exposes the uncomfortable reality behind this case. These deaths weren't inevitable, they were preventable. And if there's one lesson buried under all the heartbreak, it's this: tragedies don't appear out of nowhere. They grow in the silence between symptoms and treatment, in the space where a system looks away, and in the moments when help comes too late. What you do with that truth is up to you.